What happens when a dictator spends 5 years building a weapon out of human beings and then watches every door that weapon depends on slam shut one by one until there's nothing left to push through? That's exactly what just happened on Latvia's eastern frontier, and the man who built this weapon might be more trapped by it than anyone else. Before we go further, if you want to see more breakdowns like this one, hit subscribe now, tap the like button so this reaches more people, and send this to someone who still thinks border closures in Eastern Europe don't matter to the rest of the world. They do? Stay with me, because this story gets stranger the deeper you go. On the morning of July 31st, a Latvian government official stood in front of cameras and announced something that sounded almost boring. A technical malfunction, she said. The information systems at a border crossing called Patarniki had stopped working, so the crossing would close. 2 words. Technical malfunction. That was the entire official explanation. But here's the problem. This wasn't just any crossing point. Patarniki was the last open overland gateway between Latvia and Belarus. The last one. Every other crossing point along that border had already been shut down over the previous several years, one by one, quietly, until only this single gate remained. So when Patarniki went dark, something bigger happened than a broken computer system. Latvia sealed its entire land border with Belarus. Completely. No cars, no trucks, no pedestrians, nothing moving overland between the two countries anymore. Latvian citizens still inside Belarus were told to find their way home through Lithuania or Poland instead. No timeline was given for when or if the crossing would reopen. Officials simply said updates would follow. And if you think that's just routine bureaucracy, look at what happened the day before. On July 30th, the exact same government official who later blamed a technical malfunction had issued a very different kind of warning. She told Latvian citizens currently inside Belarus not to make travel plans to come home through that crossing. Her reason wasn't technical at all. She said safe travel could not be guaranteed because of the hybrid war being waged by the Belarusian regime. So read that sequence again. One day, we cannot guarantee your safety because of hybrid warfare. The next day, sorry, just a technical glitch. That's not a coincidence. That's a government preparing the public for something it already knew was coming, wrapped in language soft enough not to trigger panic. Now let's look at the numbers, because numbers don't lie the way official statements sometimes do. During the winter months of this year, the border between Latvia and Belarus was almost silent. Border guards recorded fewer than 2 crossing attempts a day on average. Quiet. Practically nothing happening. Patrols were routine. Nights passed without incident. Then, starting on March 25th, everything changed overnight. It's as if someone flipped a switch. From that date forward, the daily average of crossing attempts jumped to 70. On the worst days, it went past 100. Guards who had spent months on quiet, uneventful shifts were suddenly facing waves of people appearing out of the forest in coordinated groups, night after night. Think about that shift. 2 attempts a day to 70 attempts a day. That is not how natural migration works. Natural migration flows change gradually. They follow seasons, wars, economic collapses, droughts, currency crashes. They don't switch on like a light bulb on a single date in March, as if someone somewhere gave an order, and thousands of people suddenly moved in unison. And the pressure wasn't spread evenly across the region either. On July 13th alone, out of 42 total crossing attempts recorded along the entire Belarus-European Union border, 41 of them happened on the Latvian side. 41 out of 42. That is not randomness. That is a deliberate, targeted funnel aimed almost entirely at one single country, while its neighbors on the same border barely registered a single attempt that day. Since 2021, Latvian authorities have recorded more than 49,000 attempted crossings that were stopped. 49,000. And this didn't happen because Latvia suddenly became an attractive destination for migrants from thousands of miles away. It happened because someone was organizing, funding, and directing this flow like a tap that gets turned on and off depending on the political weather. To understand who's holding that tap, we need to rewind to the summer of 2021. That year, the president of Belarus, a man named Alexander Lukashenko, was cornered. In August 2020, he had claimed victory in an election that most of the world considered rigged. When his own citizens took to the streets in protest, his government responded with mass arrests, more than 35,000 people detained. The world watched, and sanctions followed. Then, in May 2021, Lukashenko did something almost unbelievable. He forced a commercial passenger jet flying through Belarusian airspace to land in the capital city, Minsk, using a fake bomb threat. Why? Because there was a journalist on board who had criticized his government, and he wanted to arrest him. The plane landed. The journalist was taken off and jailed. The world reacted with fury, and even heavier sanctions landed on Belarus. Cornered, isolated, and economically strangled, Lukashenko made a threat that would define the next 5 years of Eastern European politics. He said, in plain terms, that Belarus would no longer stop migrants and illegal substances from moving toward Europe. He was essentially saying, if you punish me, I will open the floodgates and let chaos wash over your borders instead. And he didn't just say it, he built it methodically, like an actual state program. Within months, Belarus started handing out easy tourist visas to people from the Middle East and Africa. The national airline doubled its flights from cities like Istanbul, Damascus, and Dubai straight into Minsk. According to testimony given by a European Union official to the European Parliament, people who landed in Minsk were then escorted directly to the border by Belarusian security forces. Not stopped, not questioned. Escorted as if they were guests being delivered to a destination rather than migrants crossing illegally. By November 2021, thousands of people were massed at the Polish border, trapped in freezing forests, used as pawns in a geopolitical game they likely never fully understood. Families with small children slept outside in near-freezing temperatures, while two governments used their suffering as leverage. The president of the European Commission called it exactly what it was, not a migration crisis, a hybrid attack. And the Polish prime minister at the time pointed directly at who he believed was really behind it, Vladimir Putin. Europe responded with sanctions, emergency measures, and border fences. But the pressure never actually stopped. It just moved. It rerouted. And in 2025, it surged again, this time with flights running out of Egyptian resort towns straight into Minsk. German authorities estimated that around half of all illegal entries into Germany were once again flowing through this exact same Belarusian pipeline. The weapon stayed the same for 5 years. Only the target changed. And in recent months, that target became almost exclusively one country, Latvia. So why Latvia? Why did the pressure concentrate so heavily on this one small Baltic nation? The head of Latvia's state border guard, a general named Guntis Pujets, answered that question directly in an interview back in July. He laid out several reasons, and none of them are subtle. First, Latvia has been one of Ukraine's loudest and most consistent supporters since Russia's full-scale invasion began. It has sent weapons, funded reconstruction, and repeatedly used its diplomatic voice to push for tougher sanctions on Moscow. Second, Latvia made a decision that particularly angered Moscow. It banned Russian-language state propaganda broadcasts inside its own borders, cutting off a channel that Russia had used for years to influence Latvia's large Russian-speaking population. Third, Russian disinformation campaigns have been actively spreading the narrative that Latvian territory is somehow being used to support Ukrainian strikes against Russia. And finally, there's timing. Latvia has upcoming parliamentary elections. According to Pujats, the goal isn't random chaos, it's calculated. The aim is to create public frustration, to make citizens feel their government cannot control its own borders, to divide the population, and ultimately to help push politicians who are more sympathetic to Moscow's interests into positions of power. In other words, this migration pressure is doing two jobs at once. It's punishing Latvia for standing with Ukraine, and it's trying to manipulate an election from the outside, quietly, without a single tank crossing a border. The numbers on the ground back this up. This year alone, more than 16,600 people have already been intercepted trying to cross illegally into Latvia. Last year's total was over 12,000. On the worst days, attempts have exceeded 200 in a single day. And it's not peaceful anymore either. According to the border guard commander, the smugglers organizing these crossings have become increasingly aggressive, ramming border patrol vehicles and forcing guards to use specialized equipment, sometimes even firing warning shots. In an honest admission, the commander acknowledged that because the border infrastructure isn't fully finished yet, roughly 10% of people attempting to cross still get through. Because of this, Latvia has asked its military for broader support, extended emergency security measures on the border until the end of the year, and is now receiving help from allied troops sent by Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland. This is no longer just a border guard. Problem: it has become a full national security operation involving multiple countries' armed forces. If you're finding this as unsettling as I do, take a second to like this video. It genuinely helps push this kind of reporting to more people who need to see the full picture, not just the headlines. Now let's keep going. Because the story on the other side of the border is even stranger. While Latvia has spent years slowly locking every single door on this border, Belarus has been doing the exact opposite in one very specific way. In July 2024, Lukashenko announced visa-free entry for citizens of 38 European countries. His government extended this policy twice, and it's now valid until the end of 2026. The terms sound almost welcoming. Entry by passport alone, through any international crossing, whether by land, rail, or air. Stays of up to 30 days. And for citizens of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, including people in Latvia without full citizenship status, that stay extends to 90 days. Belarus is marketing this as proof that it's a normal, open country, eager to welcome tourists and business partners. According to their own official numbers, more than 210,000 visitors from those 38 countries have already entered since the start of the year. But look at how the other side of the border sees that exact same open gate. Security agencies in both Latvia and Lithuania have spent the year actively warning their own citizens to stay away from Belarus. In their eyes, anyone who walks through that visa-free door isn't stepping into a friendly neighboring country. They're stepping into a place where their safety depends entirely on the mercy of an authoritarian regime, a regime that has already shown it's willing to use foreign nationals as bargaining chips. So you end up with this strange contradiction. Lukashenko's government pushes migrants outward to destabilize its neighbors, while simultaneously inviting Europeans inward to sell the image of a normal, welcoming nation. Two completely opposite gates, operating at the same time, on the same border, run by the same regime. And the only winner in either direction is the regime itself. Latvia's decision on July 31st dropped a steel shutter right into the middle of that entire game. So who actually pays the price for this closure, and how steep is that price? On paper, the direct economic damage to Belarus looks fairly small. Years of European sanctions and earlier border closures had already drained most meaningful trade and travel between the two sides long before this latest shutdown. But the real cost here isn't measured in trade numbers, it's strategic. Every gate that closes cuts one more thread connecting Belarus to Europe, and with every thread cut, the regime becomes a little more dependent on Russia, a little more isolated, a little more cornered by its own choices, even as it keeps insisting to its own people that everything is fine. And here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because Russia's own response tells you everything about how weak its position actually is. Exactly 1 month before Latvia's announcement, on July 1st, Russia signed its own decree closing 7 railway crossing points along its borders with Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. No public justification was given, but the timing is telling. Just weeks earlier, Russia had doubled the railway freight tariffs charged to these neighboring countries. And just days before the decree, reports had emerged warning that Russia might be preparing some kind of provocation against the Baltic states or Poland. So did closing these crossings hurt the Russian economy? The most honest answer actually came from a Russian transportation expert himself, speaking to Russian media. He admitted plainly that because of sanctions, meaningful export and import interaction with these neighbors barely exists anymore. Nobody's coming to Russia, and nothing significant is being sent the other way. Only a small trickle of transit traffic still passes through, mostly linked to Kazakhstan and China. Think about what that admission actually means. If shutting down these crossings doesn't rattle the Russian economy, it's not because the economy is strong and resilient. It's because there was almost nothing left to lose. 4 years of sanctions had already gutted whatever trade used to flow through these routes. Russia wasn't making a bold strategic move by closing its own gates. It was closing gates that were already mostly empty and dressing it up as a decision rather than admitting it was simply catching up to a reality that had already happened. On the Latvian side, there wasn't much panic either. Officials noted this particular crossing had mainly served as a backup route for years anyway. But symbolically, the picture is unmistakable. The Iron Curtain is coming down from both directions at once, and the side with the least trade left to lose is Moscow. Meanwhile, on Latvia's other eastern frontier, the direct border with Russia itself, a similar pattern has been unfolding for years, just slightly less absolute. 2 overland crossings remain technically open, but only for motorized vehicles, and only with electronic reservation systems and strict inspections. Vehicles with Russian license plates have already been banned from entering the European Union since 2023. Unscheduled passenger bus services across this border are suspended until the end of the year. Only a single railway line remains open for transit. And running alongside all of this is a nearly 280-kilometer fence that Latvia has completed along its entire Russian border, equipped with modern surveillance technology. Latvia's government is now advancing new legislation that would ban the import of certain industrial products from both Russia and Belarus entirely, closing yet another economic channel that Moscow could theoretically use for leverage. There's a ripple effect here too, one that stretches beyond just Latvia. Lithuania's Interior Ministry has openly discussed the possibility of introducing temporary border controls with Latvia itself if migrants who cross into Latvia start moving onward into Lithuania in large numbers. Think about what that means. A hybrid pressure campaign aimed at one country is now creating enough uncertainty that a neighboring EU member state, an ally, is considering checks on its own internal EU border. That's not just a Latvia problem anymore. That's a crack forming in the trust between European Union member states, which is exactly the kind of division this entire strategy seems designed to produce. Now here's where this story stops being just about one border crossing and starts becoming something much bigger, something that stretches across the entire map of Eastern Europe, While Latvia was sealing its Belarusian border, something else was happening a few hundred kilometers away that reveals just how boxed in Russia's own position has become. Look at a map of the Baltic Sea today, with Finland and Sweden both joining NATO in recent years. That entire sea has effectively turned into what defense analysts now openly call a NATO lake. Russia's fleet, based in Kaliningrad, that small piece of Russian territory wedged between Poland and Lithuania, completely cut off from the rest of mainland Russia, now has to sail through waters controlled almost entirely by NATO members just to reach the open ocean. Lithuania was the first to really tighten the pressure here. It banned the transit of sanctioned goods heading toward Kaliningrad, choking off one of the base's key connections to the outside world. Poland went further, deploying long-range rocket systems right up near the Kaliningrad border, while also building a network of fortifications along that same perimeter as part of a larger Eastern Shield project. The result is striking. A base that was once considered a showcase of Russian military strength in the region is now being described by foreign policy analysts as Russia's soft underbelly. And it's not just outside observers saying this. According to assessments from international crisis researchers, Russian military planners themselves reportedly assume that in any real conflict, NATO would attempt to blockade Kaliningrad from the sea and seal it off entirely. A former Lithuanian foreign minister put it bluntly, look at what Ukraine managed to do in the Black Sea without even having much of a navy. Now imagine what could be done to Russia's Baltic fleet with the resources NATO actually has in this region. Then there's the Suwałki Gap. This is a narrow strip of land only about 65 kilometers wide that separates Kaliningrad from Belarus and connects the Baltic states to the rest of NATO. For years, military analysts called it the alliance's Achilles heel, the one weak point where Russia could theoretically try to cut Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia off from the rest of Europe in a crisis. That weak point is being reinforced piece by piece. Poland's Eastern Fortification Project and the joint defense lines being built by all three Baltic states converge right in this corridor. NATO's multinational battle groups, including forces based in Latvia, are positioned along the northern edge of this exact strip of land. In fact, the Canadian-led NATO brigade, stationed at the Adazi base in Latvia, has recently been upgraded from a smaller battle group to a full brigade, with Canada committing to bring in Leopard 2 tanks and more than double its troop presence there by 2026. Here's the deeper point buried inside all of this. Whoever controls this narrow corridor essentially controls the fate of Kaliningrad in a crisis. And right now, that corridor sits firmly in the hands of Poland and Lithuania, both fully committed NATO members with growing military capability and clear resolve. Putin spent years trying to use hybrid pressure, migration weapons, and disinformation to destabilize this entire region without ever firing a shot. 5 years later, he's arrived at a map where his own military outpost and his closest regional ally are both increasingly surrounded from every direction. The one doing the testing has ended up more cornered than the one being tested. If this is starting to reshape how you see the news coming out of Eastern Europe, do me a favor and share this with one person who still thinks this region is just a footnote in global politics. It isn't. Now let's finish this properly, because there's more happening behind these fences than most headlines ever mention. Let's be fair here, because a good story doesn't ignore the other side. It's entirely possible that the technical malfunction at Padarniki was real. There's no hard evidence proving Latvian officials lied about the system failure itself. Temporary closures, due to technical problems, happen at border crossings all over the world, and it would be unfair to claim otherwise without proof. Belarus, for its part, has consistently and repeatedly denied orchestrating any migration crisis. Lukashenko himself has claimed, going all the way back to 2021, that the accusations against his government are absurd and that migrants simply don't want to leave, with his government supposedly trying to convince them to return home. It's also worth acknowledging that this closure carries real costs for ordinary people. Latvian citizens who happened to be inside Belarus when the border shut were suddenly forced into long, complicated detours through other countries just to get home. Freight traffic that depended on this crossing has been disrupted. Every closure like this frays a little more of whatever human connection still exists between ordinary Latvians and Belarusians who have nothing to do with any of these political games. And it's fair to note that international human rights organizations have raised concerns over the years about how Baltic states have handled border enforcement, including reports involving people being pushed back at borders, which raises its own separate set of ethical questions that deserve honest attention. But even accounting for all of that, the surrounding pattern is hard to explain away. The same official who issued a hybrid warfare warning one day announced a purely technical malfunction the very next day. A crossing attempt rate that jumped from 2 a day to 70 a day almost overnight in a way that mirrors a switch being flipped rather than a gradual natural shift. 41 out of 42 crossing attempts across an entire international border concentrated on one single country in a single day. And above everything else, There's the fact that the architect of this entire strategy essentially confessed to it himself back in 2021, openly declaring that Belarus would stop restraining migrants heading toward Europe. An accident can happen in isolation. But when an accident T lines up perfectly with a 5-year pattern of deliberate targeted pressure, it stops looking like an accident and starts looking like just one more piece of that same pattern. So let's put all the pieces together now. When the lights went out at those border booths, a 173-kilometer stretch of land quietly transformed into one of the most tense, silent front lines in Europe. And that silence is really the most important detail in this entire story. 35 years ago, walls were coming down across this exact region. Gates were opening. Europe was stepping into an era built on the idea that borders would slowly matter less and less. Today, in the eastern part of that same continent, something almost opposite is rising. Trenches, fences, sealed crossings, watchtowers with smart sensors scanning the tree line every night. But here's the crucial difference. The walls built during the Cold War existed to trap people inside, to prevent citizens from escaping toward freedom. The fences going up today exist for the opposite reason. They're being built to lock out a regime that has learned to weaponize desperate human beings as tools of political pressure. And that changes how we should think about security in this part of the world going forward. It might sound strange, but in the years ahead, one of the clearest signs of stability along these borders won't be noise. It will be silence. A loud, chaotic border filled with drone alerts, mass crossing attempts, and paralyzed airports tells you exactly where pressure is currently being applied. But a border that suddenly goes quiet tells you something else entirely. It means either an attack has just been successfully repelled, or the next one is already being prepared in the shadows, waiting for its moment. Putin built a strategy meant to fracture Europe from the outside in, without ever needing to fire a single shot. He used desperate migrants as a pressure valve, released and restricted depending on his political needs. But 5 years later, that same strategy has helped push NATO troops closer to his borders, turned his own naval base into a geographic trap, and handed his closest regional ally, Belarus, an even deeper dependence on Moscow with fewer open doors to the outside world than ever before. The tester built a weapon meant to corner his enemies. Instead, piece by piece, gate by gate, fence by fence, he cornered himself. And now, standing at a nearly silent border in Latvia, the real question isn't whether the next test will come. It's simply where and when